It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the founder of happyfamilies.com.au and the parenting expert on Channel 9's Parental Guidance, Season 2, coming soon. Caitlin O'Meara is a speech pathologist and the WA State Manager at Allied Health Company Physio Inc. She joins me in just a moment to talk about kids and speech difficulties, speech delays, language challenges, and everything related to what comes out of our children's mouth. And I wanted to have a chat with Caitlin because many years ago, one of my kids, for about the first maybe 5 years, perhaps even 6 years of her life, nobody could understand a word that she said. I mean, massive speech and language challenges. Even Kylie and I were only able to understand her from time to time. It meant that when she went to school with this speech and language challenge, she wasn't able to make friends. Nobody wanted to talk to her because she was and she just couldn't. That was how she talked. It was kind of like grunts and groans and which was terribly uncomfortable for us, but it was also horrible for her. Not only did she struggle to make friends, but we experienced all kinds of behavioural issues because she felt frustrated. We couldn't understand her. Nobody could help her. She couldn't get access to the things that she needed and wanted, and it made life very, very challenging. There are a lot of kids around this country, around the world, who experience similar kinds of challenges. And that's why I wanted to have a chat with Caitlin today to see if we can help parents whose kids might be in those situations. What do we need to know about how our children's speech and language develops? What's the difference between speech and language, and is it important? And a whole lot more. Caitlin, thanks so much for joining me this morning on the Happy Families podcast. It's so nice to talk to you.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for having me on. It's very exciting to be here.
So let's dive straight into it. Speech, language, they're different. Tell us how and why.
Yes. So speech is the actual words that we're using and the articulation of those words. And then language is more our vocabulary. So they are very different, but most people do group them into the same category.
Okay, so when we talk about our kids' speech difficulties, that means that they're not using their mouth properly, or they can't form the words, whereas the language is the capacity to find the words that need to be said.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, great. Let's talk about milestones. At what point do we start to see speech and language developing kids? Let's go through those first kind of, it all really happens in the first 3 years. So let's step through those first couple of years and talk about how kids experience the development of speech and language.
Yeah, absolutely. So at about 12 months old, you can expect your child to be understanding about 10 words. They're going to respond to their name. They will also recognise words like hi and bye. They should be saying 1 or 2 words, and then we actually see that jump right up at about 18 months to about 6 to 20 words.
I've got to interrupt you there just to highlight, like a lot of parents, they really want their kids to get on with this, right? But you're essentially saying that for the first 12 months, they're not going to say anything. Like the kids don't look at you and say, I'm pretty uncomfortable. The nappy rash is getting a bit much, Mum, and it's starting to burn. If you could just change the nappy for me now, that'd be great. They don't know how to articulate that. My sister keeps on pinching me when you're not looking. That's why I'm crying. They can't tell us any of that, right? 12 months.
That's exactly right.
10 words.
Right. That is right. However, they will be communicating in other ways. So even though they might not be using words, they'll be using sounds, they'll be using gesture, they might be vocalizing. So there are different ways that your baby will be communicating with you. It just won't be words until about that 12-month mark. Yeah.
All right. And then they get a couple of words from around about that 1 year where they start to say mum, 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 or dad, dad, dad.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And then when we get up to 2 years old, we're starting to see quite a lot more development, I suppose, in that speech and language space. So your child will probably have about 50 words. They'll also start to combine words. So 2 words at a time, which is very exciting for parents because that's the start of sentences, obviously. But they'll also be understanding a lot more too. So they'll be able to understand what questions, where questions. They might recognise body parts. If you're reading books with them, they'll be able to recognise familiar items or pictures in those books as well. And they'll be able to follow really simple instructions.
So from an applied point of view, I remember reading, and I did a little bit of speech and language stuff when I was doing my my undergrad studies because it overlaps with a bit of psychology there. And I remember reading that if you want to help your children to develop their speech and language, one of the most important things you can do is basically spend all day being the tour guide, point things out and describe them. So you don't just say, look at the dog, you say, look at the black dog, or look at the brown dog, or look at the brindle dog. You'll talk about the blue sky or the yellow sun, or you'll talk about the green ball. So you want to be nice and descriptive and get that happening. Is there anything else that parents can do to accelerate their kids' capacity to use their words and express themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really interesting point that you made. I guess being the narrator of your child's life is a really good tip to do, especially when you're wanting to encourage language, because one of the things that we want to avoid is instructing a child to say a word. And there's a few different reasons that we don't want to do that, but instead of is that we want to comment. And like what you mentioned, commenting using a range of different words, such as descriptive words or action words, so that they can start combining words together. So instead of truck, we might then add a word and say, you're pushing the truck. So we've given them that action word while we're doing that action as well, so that we're providing the context and they're starting to understand what that word means before they can then go and use it.
So that also reminds me, Caitlin, of the, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called overgeneralisation. So a child will learn that this is what a dog looks like, but then anything that looks like a dog, so a cat or a cow or anything, they're just dog, dog, dog. Everything's dog, yeah. Right?
That's right. That's really common. Yes, they start to recognize, that animal there has 4 legs and a tail. It must mean it's a dog.
Yeah, same features. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Over time, as we as adults model what the words are for these different items or objects, that your child will begin to learn the difference between the two and start to discriminate and use the correct term.
Now, presumably, we don't say, no, it's not a dog, it's a cow. Get it right. Like when we don't get cranky at them, what's the best way to help them to understand that they have overgeneralized?
Yeah, that's right. So you just jump in and you would use the correct term instead. Oh, I can see that's a cat. Oh, that's a really, fluffy cat, whatever you might be saying. And you probably would want to try and repeat that correct word about 3 times.
Right.
So that you've modeled it a lot. And kids need a lot of repetition. So model those words, but also then waiting in anticipation to give your child the opportunity to say the correct word, but without the pressure for them to actually say it. So if they don't say it, that's fine. We move on, because it is about that positive interaction at the end of the day too. Interaction comes before communication. So
yeah, I love that. Okay, so let's keep going through these timeframes. So we've got kids up to, we're up to about age 3 now. This, if I'm remembering correctly, this is the bit where kids start to, I can't remember what the term for it is, but instead of saying I jumped, they'll say I jumpted. Like they extend their words. They get all of the prefixes and suffixes wrong. What do we call that?
Yeah, so at 3, they're starting to use past tense and they're starting to talk about, or I shouldn't say use past tense, they start to talk about things in the past, but their grammar is not correctly used. So that's why we get jumped it instead of jumped. So that's really, really common at around 3 years old, and it's expected to be seen.
Yeah. So it's not like your child's got a speech or language problem at that point. It's just the way their language is developing, and they'll get there eventually.
That's right. They haven't applied the correct grammatical forms to the words that they are starting to learn, and mostly it's really common with those verbs. So jumping becomes jumped, or jump even as well. So we're looking at the past tense as well as the current tense too. So that comes with time.
Yeah. So what I've noticed, Caitlin, is that around about, if your child's developing along the typical time frame, somewhere around the age of 3 to 4, they've got this fairly expansive vocabulary. They're easily understood. They're obviously mobile, and a lot of parents start to treat their children like they're fully capable and fully competent, and the expectations go up a lot. But this doesn't always work out, right? Like I mentioned at the start of the podcast, I've got a daughter who had some really significant challenges. When should a parent start to worry, seek help, talk to a speechy or a GP or a health professional about their children's speech or language challenges? What are the warning signs?
Yeah, so as children grow, they should be learning new skills, and if they're not learning those new skills, then often they may not be meeting those developmental milestones, regardless of whether that's within the communication realm or gross motor realm. And any time that they're not meeting those communication milestones or their developmental milestones would be reason to have concern. in saying that, if they are meeting those developmental milestones and you as a parent still have concerns, then it's really recommended that you trust that. You guys are the experts on your children. So we would then encourage you to go and speak with your child's doctor to voice your concerns, and they'll often then recommend or encourage you to go and get a speech pathology assessment completed. And I guess some of the general red flags, apart from looking at developmental milestones that should be met at different stages, would be things like if there was a really big loss or change in skill development, if they're not interacting very well with other adults or other kids, if they're not responding to visual stimuli, or if they're not responding to sound. So if you're standing behind them and you've said their name and they're not turning around or making any acknowledgement that you've said something. So those are some more general type red flags that would be cause for concern as well.
Talking with Caitlin O'Meara. Caitlin is involved with the allied health company Physio Inc., where she's the WA state manager. After the break, we're going to have a conversation about how we can communicate better with our child to help them to develop their speech and language, as well as the current challenge that we're facing, because if your kids need help, there's a bit of a speechy shortage. We'll find out what we can do about those issues and more right after the break. The unhealthy, unhelpful boy code that is rampant in our children's school and social environments encourages some persistent and dangerous ideas about what it means to be male. But the Building Better Boys webinar is here to help unpack these cultural ideas and help guide our boys to be brilliant, beautiful, and even better. Building Better Boys is available today online at happyfamilies.com.au. It's the Happy Families podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. Today, I'm having a delightful conversation with Caitlin O'Meara, a speech pathologist and the WA state manager at allied health company Physio Inc. So, Caitlin, if I want to help my kids to learn their words, if I want to help them to do well with their speech and language development, what are 2 or 3 quick tips that are going to be helpful for a time-poor parent who just wants to know what to do?
2 or 3 tips. It's very hard to narrow it down to that. But I think following your child's lead is a really big one. And what I mean by that is letting go of our own agenda as adults and interacting with your child with the activity or the toy that they're interested in that moment. And if they're playing with it in a kind of non-traditional way, accepting that and being flexible with that. When we think about play, it is, spontaneous activity of children. So joining into that play by making comments on what they're doing. My second tip would be not asking lots and lots of questions. So life is not a quiz and kids get really bored of that game. So we more just want to provide comments on what they're doing and narrate, like we mentioned before, the environment as well. So we like to balance questions and comments, and the general rule of thumb is 4 comments to every 1 question, so that your child actually is being given the language as opposed to being tested all the time. And probably the third tip would be if your child is using words, then adding on to those words, like we mentioned before, by adding 1 extra word or 2 extra words, so that they're starting to see what that next stage of sentence development could be. And you're using a variety of words. So the descriptors, the adjectives, the action words, all of those kinds of things as well, so that we're not just labeling table, chair, things like that.
Yeah, I love that. Because I'm the world's worst interviewer and I can't help myself, I've always got to throw a couple of extras in. I'm going to mention 2 others that popped into my head as I was listening to what you said, Caitlin. The first is that if we can minimise our screen time and spend more time face-to-face. It seems like if we spend more time face-to-face, we're going to communicate more, and looking at our screen undermines that. And screens don't help kids learn speech and language anything like being face-to-face with us does. It's too passive. It's the active interaction, the serve and return, the back and forth. And the other thing that I was thinking of while you were talking was just the power of reading to our kids, like putting them on our lap and reading books to them. It does wonders for their vocabulary. It's amazing what happens for their ability to get what language is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Reading is a really great activity to be doing with your child. And I think the only point with that is making sure that we're following their lead, even when we are reading a book to them. I think a lot of adults like to sit down and read the book from start to finish, and you can't skip a word and you can't skip a page. And children will go off on their own agenda with that. And that's okay. We need to allow that. If they're skipping or they're reading the book the wrong way or they're just pointing to pictures, that's okay. But it does provide a lot of different vocabulary to comment on, which is also within context, which is what we always want to make sure we're doing as well when we're speaking to our kids.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that, Caitlin. I remember reading an article that emphasised that as adults, we actually read too fast to our kids, and they benefit from a speech and language point of view if we just slow the reading down and, like you said, let them lead. So if they want to point to something, we can describe what's on the page. We can talk about the characters' emotions on their faces or the colours of the clothing that they're wearing. It's not about getting through the book. It's about having the connection time and the conversation. All right, so let's talk about something that's particularly practical and particularly pressing. At the moment, we've got a healthcare provider shortage around the nation when it comes to psychological help, when it comes to medical help, and even when it comes to speech pathology help. If people have been listening to this conversation and they've got little kids up to maybe the age of 4, 5, even 6, and they're thinking, my child's not doing well, my child's not meeting the milestones, they're not quite where they should be, what do we do about these wait lists? I mean, if you want to get to see a speechy, some people are waiting, 6 months, 9 months to be able to get in and see a speech pathologist. What can people do? What can we do as a nation, as a society to help here? What's the deal?
Yeah, it is really concerning that there is a shortage, because it does create these really long wait lists. In some parts, we're looking at 18 months plus to go and be able to see a speech pathologist. And given, there is so much evidence behind early intervention, it does cause a lot of stress for parents. I think that as a nation, we really need to be offering more speech pathology courses at universities. But also what I see is when speech pathologists do enter the workforce is that they are burning out a lot quicker than perhaps previously, because they are getting overloaded, because there are such huge wait lists. So that pressure to take on a bigger caseload, more kids, that kind of thing really is there. And so they're getting burnt out a lot quicker. So trying to then recruit or retain speech pathologists becomes more difficult as well. So I think we really need to protect therapists once they are in the workforce so that we don't see that burnout happen.
Caitlin, why is there so much work to be done here? Are we seeing more kids with more diagnoses for any particular reason? Do you know why we've got such an overburdened system, particularly with something like speech therapy?
I think the awareness of children's speech and language development is really prevalent at the moment, I suppose. And so more and more parents are aware if their child is not meeting those milestones. And so they're seeking the support, which is fantastic. We want people to be taking action early and as early as possible. So I think that might be perhaps one of the reasons why we're seeing this huge demand at the moment. Also, obviously, with COVID having happened, a lot of children have not had a lot of social interaction and have not had that opportunity to be around a really language-enriched environment with different people. So that will also be affecting their ability to develop skills in speech and language areas.
I was going to ask if that had an impact. Well, Caitlin, absolutely delightful to have a chat with you. I hope this has been a helpful conversation for parents who are raising kids and want to make sure that they're raising them in such a way that their speech and language is going to be okay. It's obviously critically important as a skill, the ability to communicate. An absolute delight to talk to you. Thanks for joining me on the Happy Families podcast.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Caitlin O'Meara is a speech pathologist and the WA State Manager at the allied health company Physio Inc. If you'd like more information about the things that we've talked about, we've got a couple of links in the show notes where you can go and find some additional support, some guidance for what to do and how to do it, who to speak to get that help. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And if you'd like more info about how to make your family happier, we would just love it if you would become a Happy Families member. It will make your family happier. Dead set, fair dinkum guaranteed. The feedback from so many people who are Happy Families members has shown that already. Oh, or you could listen to tomorrow's podcast. We're going to be talking about what you can do to be a happier parent. That's first thing tomorrow when the podcast drops. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. More information is available, as always, at happyfamilies.com.au.